Really sad to see so many Palestinians have been killed in the latest Israeli war on the Gaza Strip. Hi, I'm Kaveh Tafwi. Welcome to Economic Divide. Coming up in today's program, the military cost of Israel's onslaught on the Gaza Strip. From the price of the bombs that were fired from the Iron Dome missile system to other military hardware. We'll also compare that to the military cost of the Palestinian resistance factions. Who do you think came out on top? Next, we will take a look at the economic hit due to the war. Israel was just growing out of the COVID-19 pandemic. It had mass vaccinations, hoping to get its economy going again. Then, because of this, did investments fall? What about business closures? Things that maybe Israel did not consider in its calculations. Then comes a call from the BDS movement: boycott, divestment, and sanctions. A boycott of firms complicit in Israel's occupation is what the BDS movement called. Did their voices get heard? Did the international community react? Things that we'll be looking at.
It was a brutal war. Israel bombed Gaza. There were civilian casualties. On the Israeli side, 11 were killed. On the Palestinian side, about 300. Disproportionate. But another area was also uneven. Rockets from the Gaza Strip, over 4,000, disrupting Israeli lives who ran for cover. Businesses closed across the occupied territories. Israel had hoped to recover lost business from the pandemic, but those numbers would be scrapped for now.
It's a bit stressful, this situation. We are not used to it here in Tel Aviv.
Had Israel thought through the economic risks?
We are privileged to have with us today for this segment a very special guest. He is none other than the former UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestine, Richard Falk. He has written for publications including The Nation, Huffington Post, and Al Jazeera. Richard, thank you so much for joining us here on Economic Divide. This war that Israel has waged on the Gaza Strip involving the shelling and the bombing is costing Israel a lot. First, the military cost. Iron Dome interceptors between $50,000 to $100,000 each. Palestinian factions have fired over 4,000 missiles so far. A lot of money trying to intercept these missiles from that Israel is trying to intercept, along with other military costs. What do you make of that? Do you think this is affecting Israel's economy?
Well, I think it's a minor effect as far as the encounter is concerned. It certainly has an impact on Israel, but Israel, I don't think, will feel the pressure of the economic consequences of this upsurge of violence as much as the political consequences, which are much more serious for them. They have always emphasized in these military operations against Gaza that they're also field testing new weapon systems that they then are able to sell at a premium to other countries.
Okay, thank you so much. We appreciate that, Richard Falk talking there. Of course, Richard Falk is the former UN Special Rapporteur for the Palestinian territories. We appreciate his comments. When Israel decided to harshly crack down on Palestinians who wanted to pray at al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which led eventually to the Gaza war, did it calculate the economic losses of its offensive? Well, here's a snapshot of how Israel was doing up until the war. Now, as you can see, for the years 2018 and 2019, which is coming up shortly, well, there was modest growth there, 3.5% and 3.4%. But then came the dip, the GDP contraction of over 20% for the year 2020. Economic growth expectations were high for 2021 due to the vaccination of more than 50% of its population, but 6.3%, that was the projection. That did not come into fruition, however. Now, the unemployment figure in Israel was shockingly high relative to the GDP contraction. Prior to the COVID-19, the unemployment rate, which was reported at that time, as we can see over here, was 30%, a little over 30% prior to the pandemic, but it hit over 30% last year, counting the ones that were on furlough. After the vaccination program, it decreased down to 16.7% for the month of February. Now let's take a look at the poverty rate in Israel. The economic fallout from COVID-19 had a devastating impact on many sectors across the board. Now, the rate stood at 30% at the end of last year, which also is reflective of an inequality problem that Israel is facing. These are things that not many know about. So putting these economic figures next to each other, it's easy to see that Israel's economy was not even doing that great going into the war. But you wouldn't know that listening to the Prime Minister, in which this is what he had to say.
This is a great day. We're opening with a green passport, restaurants coming back to life. We still have to watch ourselves. We have to wear masks, keep the distances that the people require, but social distance. But we're coming out of it.
Very optimistic there. Well, here is the most shocking fact about Israel's economy, and it's something that Israel always seems to boast about, that it's doing well, that it has an advanced economy, but it couldn't be further from the truth.
We also discussed Israel's unique and frankly deeply troubling predicament as a democracy grappling with a pandemic in the context of a constitutional crisis that has left the political system virtually paralyzed.
Okay, that's a presenter from I-24. It's an Israeli channel. But let's review what he said, because it's very important. And again, it's something that's under the radar. It's not really covered that much. First of all, at the time the COVID-19 hit Israel, Israel suffered from a recession. So that's number one. Then you had business closures that happened as a result of that. Of course, the pandemic led to business closures, and it also suffered from unemployment. These are all economic factors that has constituted to Israel's economic crisis. Now, Israel has had elections 4 times for the prime minister position, but without a clear winner for that post. So therefore, it is suffering from a constitutional crisis, one which has not only left the political system paralyzed, but has affected its budget and subsequent spending.
As a result, Israel, incredibly, has had to contend with a pandemic without a state budget. Believe it or not, we're still running on a budget conceived in 2017, and the current government is on the verge of collapse because it has failed to pass a budget for the remainder of 2020, let alone 2021.
Well, you can see how bad Israel is doing. I mean, no budget for 2020 and no budget for the year 2021. Well, how can it operate then? I mean, how can it spend money? How did things get so bad? I mean, how did Israel slide to what many have called both an economic and political bankruptcy?
Above all, Prime Minister Netanyahu, I mean, he takes the responsibility. In the last years, it's not really governments, because Netanyahu does whatever he wants. He really became a one-show man for the good and for the bad, and all the responsibility is on his shoulder for the good and for the bad. The good things that happen to Israel, the bad things that happen to Israel, they are right now all Netanyahu, because he doesn't let anyone else really to run any kind of independent policy.
Keyword there, independent. Okay, that was Gideon Levy, author and journalist. Let's get some sense of why Israel then would wage a war at this point in time with an economy that is surely not on stable footing. We're going to bring in Blaine Coleman in a second. He's an activist for the BDS movement into this segment. He's also a commentator at public meetings at the Ann Arbor City Council and at the Central Student Government at the University of Michigan. But before we bring him in, we're going to show you in action at the Ann Arbor Human Rights Commission, taking a stance on the U.S. military aid to Israel, which gives us a sense where he comes from when it comes to Israel.
Up to now, no American city council has passed a resolution to cut off military aid to Israel. And asking to cut off military aid to Israel is a very, very modest proposal, considering how they've used that military aid to massacre many, many Palestinians. I don't have to tell you that Israel shot down thousands of human rights demonstrators who are Palestinian in Gaza, who are unarmed human rights demonstrators. Israel shot them down.
Okay, there you saw him in action. Well, let me bring him in and ask him about what he thinks in terms of the war. Blaine, we're looking at the economy of Israel, the fighting with Hamas, weakening Israel's economic growth for Q1 and may dent 2021's Israel's economy for the year 2021 in terms of the growth. Now, at this point, Israel's economy has contracted by 6.5% for the first quarter. The Central Bureau of Statistics said this could curb its economic recovery from the pandemic. Has Israel figured this into its cost when it waged the war?
Well, you know, I don't read Haaretz and Jerusalem Post and the Zionist press, so I don't know what they're thinking, but I imagine that they have figured all of those economic costs in. I can tell you that apartheid South Africa had all kinds of costs like that while it was, you know, wreaking havoc across Africa in the 1970s and 80s. And I imagine their economy contracted a bit. This is not what doomed apartheid South Africa, the dollars and cents. What doomed them is the political cost of the whole world just hating apartheid South Africa for being a violent, racist state. And that is the only reason they couldn't carry on, not the money part. Israel is now in the same area of its political decline. They can replace the money, they can have their economy contract, uncontract. That's not their problem. Their problem is the world is more growing to hate them, and especially the United States public is more growing to hate them for their racism. Does Israel still have a majority of the US public behind it? Yeah, but a sizable, disgusted minority of the US public really hates the racism and the apartheid of Israel.
Well, we're headed for a quick break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere. Our in-depth section is coming up, and we have more guests joining us to break down the huge economic gamble that Israel took when it assaulted Gaza.
The Israeli war on Gaza came with a cost, in more ways than one. First, the military cost. The cost of Iron Dome's interceptors, estimated to be anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 each. This is while costs of rockets fired by Hamas, somewhere between $300 to $800 each. The difference in cost, huge. But what's more important, Hamas rockets draining tens of millions of dollars from the Israeli economy at little cost to themselves. The Iron Dome is estimated to have intercepted around 4,000 rockets at a cost of $200 million. Israel says its military inflicted a heavy toll, but did it achieve its aim?
אני בא עכשיו מהבור בקריה לחמ"ל המבצעים של צה"ל. זה מרשים ביותר. כל יום שעובר אנחנו פוגעים בעוד יכולות של ארגוני הטרור. מסכלים עוד מפקדים בכירים, מפילים עוד מגדלי טרור, פוגעים בעוד מצבורי נשק.
Victory is hard to measure. In light of the military costs, there are those who profit from such wars. Above all, the weapon manufacturers provide the Israeli military with weaponry, namely the U.S. The U.S. provides Israel with around $4 billion in military aid. The catch? Israel needs to buy all of its military arsenal from the U.S. Is that why the U.S. was not so quick to lend a hand in stopping this war?
As we've said before, Israel has the right to defend itself.
I want to read something a mother named Iman in Gaza wrote 2 days ago. She said, quote, "Tonight, I put the kids to sleep in our bedroom so that when we die together." And no one would live to mourn the loss of another.
There is no equivalence between a terrorist group indiscriminately firing rockets at civilians and a country defending its people.
The statement broke me a little more because of my country's policies and funding will deny this mother's right to see her own children live without fear and to grow old without painful trauma and violence. We must condition aid to Israel on compliance with international human rights and end the apartheid. We must, with no hesitation, demand that our country recognize the unconditional support of Israel has enabled the erasure of Palestinian life and the denial of the rights of millions of refugees.
Now is the time to take a look at some of the other headlines that are making its way into our radar in the Info News section. The first item that we're going to take a look at is something we've looked at in the past week, and it concerns the crypto market. There was a crypto crash. Bitcoin, Ethereum to have plunged. This market is not going through good times right now. Nearly $1 trillion in losses. $1 trillion. It's a little bit over $2 trillion market share that it has, the crypto market. Now, the sharp drop came on top of news that China is banning cryptocurrencies, and it's going to crack down hard on where mining is occurring. Also, there's news coming from the Fed that's going to crack down on some of the crypto houses, and that again is not good news, which has led to the drop in the crypto prices. Next up, inflation. Inflation is plaguing the economic growth. Now, the rise in inflation has actually hit the U.S. economy in terms of it trying to progress and to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, because of that, investors are cutting down on their portfolios, so they're not going to invest on some of the more riskier items. They're going to go to safe bets. For example, government bonds is one option that they may take. Next up, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear talks. Some saying that nothing's going to come out of it. Others saying that there are positive signs coming from it. For example, India ready to import Iranian oil. That's a positive sign. Also, the oil market itself seems to be responding to that positive news coming from the talks, where there's been a drop of $2 per barrel. If this happens, if the JCPOA happens, and if the sanctions are removed on Iran completely, which is what Iran has requested. Again, a wait-and-see game there. Then on to child poverty. In the UK, in particular in London, where it has the highest child poverty rate of any region in the UK. What is the percentage, you may ask? Let's take a look at what that says. 40%. We're living in poverty even before the pandemic. So you can see that obviously that's a huge problem for London, and that is the capital, so you can imagine what some other regions are going through.
The numbers are out. Israel's defeat at the hands of the resistance came with a cost. The economic cost for Israel over the course of the war is reported to be $37 million per day. Another source puts that figure at almost double, $61 million a day. Neither figure is good for Israel, which is trying to recover from a pandemic-hit economic recession. The war has decreased Israel's economic growth, especially coming out of a quarter that saw a 6.5% contraction. Israel's economy was projected to grow between 5 and 7% this year on the heels of a rapid vaccination rollout. Because of the war, consumer and government spending and investment fell in the quarter, while exports rose. After all, how can business sentiment and investment remain high when Hamas rockets have reached areas in occupied Palestine that it had never reached before? Yet the key challenge facing Israel is how much unrest there will be in the occupied West Bank. For example, there was a one-day general strike in occupied Palestine. All businesses were shut. How many more of these shutdowns can Israel endure?
In this segment of the Q&A, we're going to talk about the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanction. This movement, which began years ago, has been very successful in its intention and in its goal. In this case, against Israel, there's been a number of products that have been boycotted as a result, products coming from Israel. It was responsible, after all, for the ending of the apartheid regime there in South Africa. But let's find out what our guests think about this. We're going to have the former UN Special Rapporteur Richard Falk rejoin us for this. Richard, the BDS movement has urged a military embargo on Israel, a boycott of firms who are complicit in Israel's occupation. It also is calling for the cancellation of academic, cultural, and sporting events. Do you think there's enough momentum behind the call by the BDS to basically embargo Israel?
Yes, I think it is. I think it is different. How different is uncertain, but I do think that there will be a greater show of support around the world for the BDS campaign, and specifically favoring an arms embargo, and that will have some effect. And it will also, I think, have an effect on these normalization agreements that were reached in the last period of the Trump presidency, and gave Israel a certain political sense that they could ignore Palestinian grievances and still have benevolent relations with their Arab neighbors, and particularly the Gulf countries.
All right, Gilad, do you agree with Richard Falk in terms of what he said on the BDS?
Yeah, I am one of those guys who are actually very troubled by the BDS movement. I don't have any issues with economic boycott, but I think that this movement failed completely on that front. And instead of doing that, it actually worked intensively and extensively against freedom of speech.
The war on Gaza has ended. Well, you see, it has not. Why? Because forget about the ceasefire. You can't have a ceasefire in a conflict that is over 60 years old. I mean, you can't have a ceasefire on an apartheid regime that has killed Palestinians, especially in the Gaza Strip. A war that appears to erupt every few years. So, what is the solution? Well, Palestinians need to prosper economically, for one thing. The occupied land, for another, needs to not be occupied or have an occupation regime execute its apartheid policies. That just can't happen. By the way, many of those violations are violations of human rights and even war crimes. Now, one solution: to have a referendum. A referendum to be held among the original Palestinians. This way, the governance issue at least can be solved, and most likely the rest is going to fall into place. And also on the issue of the U.S. as a broker for a peace process, well, that just hasn't worked. The last time around, it was called the deal of the century. Where is that now? Gathering dust, along with one of its architects, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who called the Palestinian-Israeli issue, by the way, a real estate transaction issue. Palestinians need their homeland, period. That does it for this edition of Economic Divide. Your questions and comments are always welcome. Do send them to us. From me, and the entire team, it's goodbye until the next program.